May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to all that is sacred. Let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's good to see so many familiar faces. When I was told that the theme for this month was integrity, I knew instantly how my sermon would unfold. Last summer, I invited a friend for lunch, and she's a world traveler and always has something interesting to share with me. However, this time was very different. When she came, she told me that she had been going through her family things, and she discovered a book that she thought I might like to read. The title of the book was 22 Years a Slave and 40 Years a Free Man, published in 1857. It was written by a gentleman called Austin Steward, a slave who became a free man. And she went on to tell me that this book had been passed down in her family over the years on her father's side. And I was just deeply moved, and I told her I was so thrilled to read this book, especially since I had just seen the movie 12 Years a Slave about Solomon Northrop. And upon doing some research on her book, I was able to tell her it was a first edition. Well, after reading it, I realized that Austin Steward is one of the unsung heroes of the abolitionist movement. We all know Frederick Douglass, but Austin actually paved the way for him by demythologizing stereotypes of former slaves. Austin is really an important historical figure in the Finger Lakes. And by this I mean Rochester, Canandaigua, Farmington, Oaks Corners, Phelps, Sodus, Geneva, Palmyra, and Bath. He touched all of those places. And his earthly remains are buried in the West Avenue Cemetery in Canandaigua, and you only have to go a few feet from the entrance and you will see his monument. This man, who spent much of his childhood sleeping on the floor of his master's home like a dog without even a blanket to cover him in the wintertime, grew up to become a free man whose life really embodies the meaning of the word integrity. Now, we all know what the word means, but what we may not know is that its first use was in the 14th century, and the root word integra means to bring together in unity. So integrity has much to do with wholeness. A person of integrity takes the time to think about what is right and then acts accordingly to bring about wholeness. And this is exactly what Austin Steward did his entire life. Austin was born into slavery in 1794 to Robert and Susan, who were owned by Captain William Helms in Prince William County, Virginia. By the time Austin was a teenager, Captain Helms decided to sell his plantation to settle his gambling debts and some of the other financial matters that he'd gotten himself involved in. So he packed up his household, his family, and his slaves and moved to upstate New York. Well, when Austin found out that he was coming to upstate New York, he was really afraid about this because New York was considered a place of wild country, and he had heard about Indians and bears and wolves, and he feared that he was going to be eaten by cannibals. Well, their first stop was in Sodus Bay, but they finally ended up settling in Bath. And once Captain Helm settled in Bath, New York, he decided that he would rent out Austin and his sister Mary to bring in a little additional income. Well, before I continue the story, I'd like to say that there are 3 points that I want to make today about integrity. The first point is that integrity is the very essence of our being. It comes from within, and it defines our character and our personality. And we are all on a journey towards wholeness, and we seek to be connected with each other and our world. And only in truth can this be done. The second point that I want to make is a person of integrity takes time to think, time to reflect, and discern what is right and just, and even when the consequences are unpleasant. I'm sure all of us have found ourselves in situations where things are difficult throughout our lives. And sometimes we have to silence ourselves or hold back an emotional response because we know it's the right thing to do. Or we make a decision which we know is the right thing to do, but on one level, on another level, it's very painful on a psychological and an emotional level. Now, I want to continue my story using Austin's experience to explore these points further. Austin was beaten for learning how to read. The captain's son-in-law found Austin studying in the sugar bush where he had been working, and he took time to read a book. Well, when the son-in-law discovered this, he took the book from Austin, he threw it in the fire, and he beat Austin. And he told him that he was never to have a book in his hands again. And I quote from Austin's book. He said, "Or I will whip every inch of skin off your body," unquote. After this incident, Austin was even more determined not only to learn how to read, but how to write. And he knew that he had to be very careful about being seen with a book. And as time went on, he found someone to help him, a man from the Quaker faith who reached out and helped him in this area. One Sunday morning, Austin was on his way to the Presbyterian church where he was going to ring the bell for the service. And while he was going, he decided to take a route that would take him by a house where his sister lived, where he had hoped just to stop and wave or just say hello. But unfortunately, as he neared the house, he heard the cries and the pleas of his sister as she was being brutally beaten. And I quote from his book, "Strong and athletic as I was, no hand of mine could be raised in her defense, but at the peril of both of our lives." If anyone has seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, you will recall similar situations in the movie, which I can now say, after reading Austin's book, that they very accurately reflect the brutality of flogging slaves as well as the manner in which they had to cope. No one could come to the aid of a slave being whipped. Now imagine how Austin felt when he saw this man who had just beaten his sister walk into the church and acknowledge that we should do unto others as you have them do unto you. The slave masters wanted their slaves to have the fear of God instilled in them because they could use the scriptures of the Bible to frighten them. But what the masters didn't realize is that those same scriptures also spoke of faith and hope and love. And the slaves began to identify with the stories of suffering and the stories of freedom. And even Austin began to question the integrity of the Christian faith that he had adopted. How can you say one thing and do another? As Austin traveled and worked for other plantation owners, his view of the world broadened, And one of the most memorable experiences was a celebration that took place in Oaks Corners, where the military were in full regalia, and there was a band and concessions all along the street. It was a real festival, and everyone was excited because the governor of New York State was coming to Oaks Corners with all of the troops. And Austin was so impressed by this gala, he even thought about joining the military as a means of becoming free from Captain Helm. And he talked to a liberal lawyer about how he could own himself. And through a variety of different circumstances, Austin finally ran away and eventually found his freedom through the support of Darius Comstock, who happened to be the president of the Manumission Society, which was responsible for helping to free slaves. But Captain Helms was not happy about this, so he tried to scheme to get Austin back. But with the help of Quaker brothers and the legal support from other compassionate people, Austin secured his freedom. Now, the third point that I want to make about integrity is that it calls us to a higher plane. It calls us to strive for something better, to seek unity among people, to find wholeness in ourselves, but not only ourselves, but our neighbors. And I would like to highlight more of this point by talking about Austin's journey through a timeline of events. Now, in 1816, Austin's father died in Palmyra, New York. And it was through his father's example that he became this man of integrity. He taught his son how to survive and live with dignity even when he was being treated like an animal. And Austin stated that there were no cooking utensils or eating utensils provided for his parents in their slave quarters. And there were no beds for sleeping. And Austin never knew what it was like to sleep in a bed until he was rented out to another kind-hearted plantation owner who actually provided comfortable housing for his slaves. Now, in September of 1817, Austin had actually grown to the point where he could start a meat market in the city of Rochester. And this was with the help of a gentleman called Otis Comstock, who had become a mentor to Austin. And during this time, Austin began to work with the Underground Railroad. Well, in September of 1818, Austin opened a school. It was called the Sabbath School for Children of Color here in Canandaigua. And he was assisted by his daughter. And it was the good people of Canandaigua who made donations. And the donations came from foreign countries as well as other places to teach the children of former slaves. And Austin himself was self-taught, but in his 20s, he attended an academy right here in Farmington. And he attributed most of his education to the Comstock family here in Canandaigua. And there were two brothers who did so much to help Austin. Their names are Otis and Darius Comstock. Now, on July 5th, in 1827, slavery was abolished in New York State. And Austin was chosen to give the emancipation speech for the city of Rochester. And his oration encouraged people of color to educate themselves, to develop businesses, to start businesses like he had done with his meat market, and to live lives of integrity, lives of truth. Now, in 1828, Austin was elected as a trustee of the First African Methodist Episcopal Church in the city of Rochester. And that tradition continues in the city of Rochester. Now, in 1830, Austin closed his business in Rochester and moved his family to Canada. And this move is what I consider the greatest example of integrity. He was married. He had a lovely daughter. The business was doing well. He had taken the meat market and it had developed into a grocery store. He had a great reputation as a person whose door was always open to strangers. Everyone knew that they could drop by Austin's house and be welcomed with open arms and a home-cooked meal. Everything was perfect. Yet he heard about fugitive slaves in other states who were trying to secure freedom in Canada, and he felt compelled to help them because he remembered the people who had helped him along the way, and he wanted to pay it forward, so we say today. Now, he agonized over this decision, and he even had bad dreams about it and omens telling him not to go to Canada. But he could not just stay in Rochester and let those slaves struggle. So he worked with the people who were sympathetic to organize a board and raise funds and try to establish a colony in Canada. He uprooted his family and he left his friends to help these suffering slaves make a life in Upper Canada. And he suggested that the colony be called Wilberforce, named after William Wilberforce, who worked to abolish the slave trade in England in 1807. And he also helped to end slavery in the British Empire in 1833. Well, when he arrived in Canada, he found that there were 1,100 people living in the woods. So the first thing that he did was immediately help them build houses, log houses. And he used his own savings to provide food and supplies for them. And he maintained his welcome atmosphere in Canada and told stories of Indians coming to his house for food and shelter. And one day his daughter was greeted by this emaciated Indian who was a warrior of Chief Tecumseh. And he shared the joys and sorrows of his life with Austin and his family. And Austin was known in Canada as the man who was always willing to help a stranger in the woods. His doors were always open. And he helped to secure members to establish a board to deal with these issues. And he became the president of the colony. Well, the board asked two men to travel to lecture, to raise funds, and to tell people about what was happening here. One was Mr. Paul, and he was the agent for England, Ireland, and Scotland, and Mr. Lewis was the agent for the United States. Well, in the beginning, both of these men secured funds and they sent them back to Austin. But as time went on, Austin realized that the funds were not coming in. And he kept meticulous records because of his business. And what happened? Both of the men embezzled all of the money that they had secured, and one of them actually got married and lived a life of leisure in Europe off of this money. Well, the people that Austin had now trusted betrayed him, and they blamed him for the lack of funds. And things got very ugly, and at this point, those men brought a lawsuit against Austin and forced him out of Canada. Well, Austin returned to Rochester with nothing. He had used all of the savings from his business to help this colony in Canada. And I quote from the book, "Nevertheless, I felt willing to submit the case to him who had known the purity of my intentions and who had hitherto led me through scenes dark and drear, believing he would not forsake me now in this time of need. Consoling myself with these reflections, I renewed my endeavor to do my best, leaving the event with my God." Once his friends realized what had happened, they stepped up and provided a place for Austin's family, which was now 9 people and started out as 3, and loaned him money to reestablish his business. And Austin writes in his book, "Yet truth and justice to my friends compelled me to say that after a short acquaintance, I have usually been treated with all that kindness and confidence which should exist between man and man," unquote. Now, to me, this is the ultimate example of authority, when you have sacrificed everything that you have for the greater good, when you have given all of your money and all of your efforts to help these slaves, and when you have nothing now, when your dreams have been crushed, and when you're accused of crimes that you didn't commit, your friends and others with a compassionate heart step up to help you and support you and lift you up. This is what the people of Canandaigua and Rochester did for Austin. They raised him up. And in 1831, he was elected vice president of the first annual convention of people of color in the great city of Philadelphia. Now, in April 15th, 1837, Austin's first child died at the age of 11. He did everything he could to help her. He sought out the best medical care, and he stopped working at his store to be by her bedside until she died. And she's buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester. Now, in 1842, Austin returned to Canandaigua, and he taught school, and he committed his efforts to work with the Quakers and anyone who was involved in anti-slavery efforts. He made a promise to himself that he would do whatever he could to help free slaves and to help newly freed slaves have a better life. Now, in 1847, there was a celebration of the anniversary of the West India emancipation sponsored by anti-slavery supporters here in Canandaigua. And Austin wrote this in his book, that Frederick Douglass gave the oration in only a manner like he could do. And he said, then the music was supplied by the Geneva Choir, and it was a real spirited event. Now, in 1857, Austin published his autobiography, and this book begins and ends with letters speaking to his integrity. The letters in the beginning, there's one from the governor of New York State and one from the founding families of the city of Rochester, and they all testify to the high moral character and the hard-working nature of Austin. And the letters at the end of the book all justify and prove that Austin did his very best to support the colony of Wilberforce, and that it was the result of others taking advantage of his trusting nature that caused things to fail. And his book was so popular that it was reprinted within 2 years in 1859. And then the third edition was done in 1861. And then the fourth edition was done in 1867. And Austin died 2 years later here in Canandaigua. And I believe we need to reprint his book in 2015. His message of integrity needs to be heard today more than ever. What if the world were made of people like Austin? Just imagine the integrity to sacrifice everything that you have to help people that you don't even know. If we had that type of integrity. Integrity knows no color. Integrity knows no age. Integrity knows no boundary. Integrity is a force of truth, a force of justice, a force that moves us to be compassionate like Austin, to be humble like Austin, to be beaten like Austin. And yet we rise up. We find the little light within ourselves, the light that guides us, the light that inspires us, the light that sparks the divinity within each of us to reach out, to touch another person. And we know that our road can sometimes be rugged and the road can sometimes be steep. But we struggle on our way. We continue on this path of integrity to find ourselves. So I ask you today to remember Austin's journey. I hope it has inspired you to realize one person can make a difference. I ask you today to stop by his gravesite when you're driving through the town of Canandaigua. Just pause for a few minutes and let Austin know his life was not in vain. I'm here as a result of his life. I stand on his shoulders. Let him know that you carry his light in your heart, and you carry his message of compassion, the message of justice, the message of integrity in your heart, and share it with everyone that you come in contact with. Amen. And now I'd like to dedicate this song to Austin. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Our closing hymn is We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder, number 211. are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing on. Every round goes higher, higher. Every round goes higher, higher. Every round goes higher, higher. We are climbing on. If I stumble, will you help me? If I stumble, will you help me? If I stumble, will you help me? We are climbing on. Though the road is steep and rugged, though the road is steep and rugged, though the road is steep and rugged, we are climbing on. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Let us go forth today with the spirit of Austin in our hearts and the light that he has brought into the world. Let's remember, when you are feeling alone and thinking no one cares about you, a person of integrity sends an email or a card in the mail to brighten up your day. Let us remember, when you're doing all that you can to hold things together and you're feeling like no one appreciates what you are doing, a person of integrity acknowledges that you are a valued and appreciated person and sends a gesture of kindness, such as surprising you with a bouquet of flowers or sending a card, which transforms your mood and your spirit. Let us remember, when you are self-employed and the jobs are not coming as quickly as you need them and the bills are due, a person of integrity offers to help you and sends the check in the mail or offers you a job. Let us remember, when you have lost your job and all seems hopeless, a person of integrity comes along and presents an opportunity for employment. Let us remember, when you discover that you have to make changes in your life and you have to change your diet or your daily routine, or realize that you're sick and the diagnosis doesn't look good, a person of integrity stands by your side and says, "Lean on me." When you are a caregiver and you're so exhausted and weary and you don't know where you're going to get the strength to face another day, a person of integrity sends you an email or a card to let you know that they're thinking of you. And just that little note gives you the energy to get through the whole day. Let us remember, when you are grieving the death of someone that you love, or the loss of your closest companion who just might happen to be your dog or your cat, and the tears begin to roll down your cheeks, a person of integrity will stop by your side and offer you a shoulder to cry on and say, "I am here for you. You are not alone." Let us remember, when the stress of your job is beginning to affect your relationships at home and everyone is feeling the stress, a person of integrity says, "Talk to me. Talk to me. I will listen. I am here for you." May we all strive to be that person of integrity. Amen. Amen. I just struggle to keep it up.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.